Hey everyone, before we begin this video, really quick, I just wanted to point out an error that I'll mistake later on in the video when I say I write and say for loops check their condition after running the instructions in the code block. What I meant to say there is for loops check their condition before running the instructions in the code block. Later on in the video, I explain it as for loops checking their conditions before running it, in the way that it should work. But I type and accidentally say after instead of before. But again, when I explain how they actually work, I explain it as for loops checking their condition before running the instructions in the code block. So just to clarify, for loops check their condition before running the instructions in the code block. And you'll see that when I explain it. However, I do write that they check it after. So I just want to point that out that I wrote it wrong. So just so you know. Thanks. Hey everyone, and welcome to your C++ tutorial on for loops. As you can see, I have Visual Studio Code pulled up here. I'll begin by deleting our hello world instruction, and let's just jump right into the syntax of a for loop. So a for loop starts with the for keyword. Then we have our condition here, and so our condition is actually going to have 3 parts, and we'll get into that in a second. After we evaluate our condition, we put our code instructions in our for loop scope here. And so our scope is with the start of a curly brace here and the end of a curly brace here. Now, this looks like very similar to a while loop, but a for loop has a very specific form of condition and a very special form of condition that it can use. So while this may look very similar to a while loop, the condition of a for loop is very different. So let's talk about the condition in a comment up here. So the condition of a for loop will have 3 statements in it. And the first statement is going to be sort of a starting point for the condition. So this is usually the creation of a variable. And a lot of times it looks like this. It's the integer I is equal to 0. That's a very common starting point for a for loop. The second part of the condition is the second part of the for loop condition, the second statement, is the condition that runs, or that is checked after the code block runs. Right? And so that's kind of self-explanatory. It's the actual condition, the logic that's checked, that if the logic evaluates to true, the for loop will continue running. If the logical condition evaluates to false, the for loop will exit. So there's a third statement as well. And the final statement is the instruction that is executed after the code block runs, right? So this is usually something like this, which is the initial integer and the plus plus operator, which we did not cover when we talked about operators, but the plus plus operator increments an integer by 1. So let's see what this all looks like in our for loop. So we're going to have statement 1 followed by statement 2 followed by, you guessed it, statement 3. So we'll start with statement 1 here. What I'd like to do is I'd like to make a program that's very similar to our previous programs that we created with the while loop. And so with our while loop, we created a sort of just like a number counter that counted off numbers from 0 to 50. I'd like to do the same thing here. So I'm going to start out by using our first statement example there. And I'm going to create an integer called I and set it equal to 0. Now this integer I is going to be sort of our counter or our index, and it'll be the starting point for our condition. Next, I'm going to say our condition is as long as I is less than or equal to 50, we're going to continue this loop. So this is the condition that gets checked in once our for loop finishes running. So our for loop will run these instructions. When it completes these instructions, it will check this. If this evaluates to true, it'll run through these instructions again. If this evaluates to false, it will exit this for loop and it will run the next instructions in the program. Okay, moving on to our third statement here. This is going to be the statement, the instruction that runs once the code block is executed. What we're going to do is we're going to make it the I++. So it's going to increment our I here, which is set to 0, by 1. This is very similar to the instructions and the conditions that we created for our while loop, right? But our for loop is set up so that it kind of formats these or structures these in this way. So for loops are really good for when you know sort of like where you want to begin and where you want to end. They're really good in C++ when you use them with arrays or some type of list or collection that has an index, right? Because you can set this index and then have the index increment until we get to whatever the length of the array is. But we'll get to that later. For now, all you need to know is that here are your three statements. We're starting off with the creation of an integer called I, which is sort of our counter or our index, if we had an array. And then we're going to keep incrementing I once the instructions end until I becomes greater than 50. While, or as long as I is less than or equal to 50, we're going to keep running these instructions. And all our instruction is going to say is we're just going to print out, we're going to print out our counter. And we're going to print out I. Okay, and then after this all exits, what I'd like to do is I'd like to print out end of the loop. Cool. All right, so this is our little program here. Let's compile this program, and then let's run our executable. All right, perfect. So you can see here, to begin at the very top, we start off by getting into our for loop. We've created our variable integer, which is, and the name of it is I. It's set to 0. We make sure that as long as I is less than or equal to 50, we're going to run these instructions. I is 0. 0 is less than or equal to 50. So we run our instruction, which reads, we print out counter and then the value. So we print out counter 0. Once this instruction ends, we then increment it using our I++ here, which is the instruction that is executed after the code block runs. So we increment it to 1, and then we check our condition again. We say, hey, is I less than or equal to 50? 1 is less than or equal to 50. So we run our instruction here. And we print out 1. We finish our instructions. We come to the end of the code block, and we increment I again. So we increment it to 2. We check our condition. Is 2 less than or equal to 50? It is less than 50. So we run this again. and then we print out 2. And then we increment it again once the code block is finished running, and it just keeps looping until finally we go all the way down here and we print out 50. Once we print out 50, the instructions end, and we increment it to 51. Finally, 51 is greater than 50, so this evaluates to false. When this evaluates to false, we do not run our instructions, and we proceed with the rest of the program. The rest of the program prints out end of loop, which you see down here. Down here. And we exit the program. So there you have it. There's your for loop. These are particularly good when used in conjunction with arrays or some type of list that you can count through. But they're still useful for when you have a known beginning and a known end. While loops are really good for when you need some other, you're taking user input, or you need a Boolean to be flipped or something like that. That's what a while loop is good for. So yeah, this for loops, I think it's a really powerful tool. I hope you learned something. Thanks.